Hey everybody, it's the man they call Dave and AJ Strange Brew. We're going to talk about wrestling, and god damn, we need some energy for this. AJ, tell us what we got.
Nothing's going to jack you up without the jitters like Dubby. If check out all of their merchandise, they got the coolest shakers. They've got so many different flavors, and it literally will keep you going all night long. It is Dubby. Check them out when you go to their site. Put in fans working, and we're going to give you 10% off on any order that you put in. And then you could be as jacked up as me and the man they call Dave. Dave, speaking of being jacked up, what do you got for us this week?
10%, baby. Check it out. First things first, let's get right out of the gate. Let's talk about
at what point after the Sheik book did you decide to start the book that just came out, Superheroes, a pop culture phenomenon from Ant-Man to Zorro? Almost had the title memorized there.
Better than me.
And when did you, obviously you like talking about wrestling, so was this a chance to get to talk about something besides wrestling for once?
Yes, definitely. And I did another non-wrestling book a few years ago, Godzilla FAQ. And, you know, I like to get outside of it now and then, even though wrestling's my thing. But the interesting thing is, the crazy thing is, those books really overlapped to a degree that I didn't even really plan, because I had done Godzilla FAQ, I think was the last book that I did. And I'm thinking like, hey, you know what? I got some time now. I want to try and pitch a new book. And I pitched the Superheroes book first, because that was the same company that did my Godzilla book and my Pro Wrestling FAQ book. I pitched them. I didn't hear anything back. Weeks went by. I gave up. And then I went to ECW Press and I said, okay, I'll try something wrestling related. I've never done a biography. And, you know, I settled on the Sheik as my idea. I pitched them. They accepted it. And then I started working. And about a month later, the other company got back to me about Superheroes. And I was like, whoa, hold on. Okay, we got to like plan this out. And I had to sort of stretch it out a little bit, so that I started writing the manuscript for Superheroes almost immediately after I finished writing the manuscript for Sheik, Blood and Fire. So what happened was, while we're doing the post work on the Sheik book, like laying it out, getting photography, approving all the, the different stages, I'm there writing Superheroes at the same time. So it's not the ideal way, but I mean, in a way, it's nice when they both come out and now they're like out there, you know, within a year of each other. And, you know, it's kind of nice. It was hell to get through. And I probably wouldn't have done it that way on purpose. But the crazy thing now is I'm trying to make sure that the Superheroes book doesn't kind of get lost in the shuffle a little bit, you know, because you know, I'm mostly known for the wrestling projects, and now I have my next wrestling project that I'm now starting. So I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten. You know, it's not as glamorous of a concept. You know, I'm doing a great job of selling it, right? I mean, it's not personality driven. That's the thing. And I've always found that the books like the Sheik book, it's personality driven. So, and this one is, the Superheroes book is a reference book. It's a single volume, everything you ever want to know about the history of not just comic books, but of just the whole idea of superheroes and superhero fiction. And so, you know, I feel like that book needs, in a way, it needs less work to sell, because it's one of those books, if you're interested in the subject, you're going to want to buy it. It doesn't even matter who wrote it. It's like, it doesn't even matter if they know who I am. Like, the concept sells the book.
Me and Brian, I think we talked about some similar things in wrestling. So I'm wondering if it's similar. Like, I grew up on the Bill Bixby, like Incredible Hulk, you know, the reruns of Adam West Batman, like that's stuff. And then after the Christian Bale Batman movies, I think I took a little break from superheroes for a while. And then Marvel started really, I thought, painting this great story together, you know, with all these different movies. Before I knew it, I started following all the movies since the Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr. I started watching all these Marvel movies, and I realized that, oh, this is very similar to pro wrestling. You know, I started drawing that comparison, like the storylines and what a fantastic job Marvel did of getting over certain characters. You know, like, throw an example, Doctor Strange, like he's got this backstory, but then you see him like in Avengers, and he's a big deal there. You know, like getting the main event rub, right? Like, I started drawing all these analogies and stuff too, and that was kind of how I got into this. Were you big into comic books? Like, you know, what were your favorite superheroes?
Yeah, I was a big collector I mean, my prime era of collecting, even though there's been other points in my life where I got back into it, but I was a big comic book reader from like the mid 80s into the early 90s. And then I started, you know, like having girlfriends and things like that. But I mean, those earlier years where you got so much time and you're young, and, you know, I would go to even before I discovered comic book stores, I would go to the newsstand we had around the corner every week and pick up, like, I remember back then I had like a $5 bill, and this was when comics were 65, 75 cents. And I'd buy as many as I could get for $5. And then, you know, I wound up bumping it up to $10 and all that. But I mean, I was a big, I started following comics around the time of what they now call kind of like the beginning of like the end of the Bronze Age, the beginning of the modern age in a way, like right after Crisis on Infinite Earths in DC, where they're rebooting all their characters for the first time. And right around the time of in between Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2 with Marvel. Like that was my, like, I remember one of the first books I ever bought was one of the original Secret Wars, which is, I know a lot of comic book purists, they hate Secret Wars, but if you're 9, 10 years old in 1984, 85, it is the greatest thing ever, where you've got every superhero, Marvel superhero, every Marvel supervillain, they're whisked away to this planet. And it's like this all-powerful being saying, okay, now fight each other. It's like the greatest idea ever. So that's what got me into comics and really interested in comics. The first, yeah, that was the beginning of it.
Now, do you have a preference of DC or Marvel, or does it just depend on the story? Or
I was way into Marvel over DC for really in the 80s and 90s, which was my heyday of comics collecting. I was way more of a Marvel fan. In fact, the only DC that I regularly enjoyed was Batman and Superman, the two big characters. And again, that was because, and Dave, I know you remember this, back in those ancient days when it came to movies, that's all you got. That was it. There was Batman movies and there was Superman movies. And so, like, you know, that's what I read. I wasn't into the wider DC universe. That changed in the early 2000s. By that point, I wasn't collecting as heavily as usual. It would take, you know, I was married, I had kids, I had a job, a career. So it would take really special things to pull me back in. And that's the era when DC started doing these really interesting things. They were doing like Identity Crisis. They did the original 52. There was a lot of like, they were trying to like tie their continuity together in really interesting ways. They were getting a lot of great artists in. That's when they were doing, they did All-Star Superman with Frank Quitely, which is like one of the greatest Superman stories ever. Things like that were bringing me into DC in a broader way that I never had been involved before. And in fact, I thought that they had it over Marvel for a while until the Marvel movies started coming out. And now I feel like in the last 15 years, in the wake of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, really, as much as it pains me to say, the movies have completely overshadowed the comic books as far as like where people are discovering superheroes, even kids. Like I've worked with kids as a teacher, and this will be depressing for people my age, but I'll bring up superheroes, and a lot of these kids don't even know that the characters came from comic books. They only know them from the movies. And so when I start talking about comic books, they're like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, like what? I've never seen a comic book in my life, you know, but that's where we're at right now.
It's interesting.
That's wild. I remember when I was young, my grandparents, they had saved these comics that came in the Sunday papers. It was like its own little flyer. So when I was young, I had these collections of like serialized comics, and you could go from week to week and follow the story. And it's just not a way that comics are taken in anymore.
Right. The ongoing, that's the other thing too, is now even for people that do still collect and read comics, it's much more common for people to buy these trade paperbacks and the collected editions. So it's like when you have the monthly comics coming out, you have people going like, well, I'm going to wait until the whole thing gets collected and then I'm going to buy it that way. And that's like, that's such an alien thing to me. Like for me, it was always the other way around. You'd get the original issues and because they were really collectible. And then if you really liked it, then when the paperback came out, you'd buy that too on top of it, you know? So it's definitely, there's like massive changes going on. I keep hearing rumors that, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next generation or so that comic books, especially the major comics, just go away. You know, like Warner Media has been talking, because they own DC Comics.
Right.
It's been rumbling for a while now that they might shut down their comics division entirely, which is insane to think of, that there would be no Superman or Batman comic books. But they're looking at it and going like, why are we still doing this? Because the sales are so tiny these days compared to what they used to be.
How do you feel about James Gunn taking over DC now? Do you think it's promising, or what do you land on that?
You know, I try to be hopeful, because I don't, and in the book, if you read my book, the book has a bias. Any book you ever read will have a bias. And I'm in there very vocally saying that DC has really dropped the ball compared to Marvel in terms of what they've done with their movie universe. It's been confusing.
Yeah.
It's been a mess. You got multiple versions of Batman. You got 3 different Jokers floating around. Like, what are they even doing? You got the TV continuity separate from the movie continuity. It's just all over the place. And so I'm hopeful when they say, okay, James Gunn, who I loved from Guardians of the Galaxy, you want to talk about wrestling? He took a jabroni jobber team and he made them into the main event. You know, every superhero movie that has been made since Guardians is trying to be like Guardians. And whoever saw that coming? And I mean, across all the different companies too. No one saw that coming. But so I'm hopeful. But I have to say, when I look at what he actually has planned, it's not that I'm going like, oh, this is going to stink. It's not something I look at where I'm like, oh, wow, okay, it's in good hands now. It's something I look at and I go, I'm going to wait and see how this turns out, because this could be great. And this could wind up being even worse than what they were doing before. So I have to wait and see. It's a real wait and see thing for me, honestly.
Yeah, I get that. I'm kind of saying I'm hopeful. Like I hope.
I'm hopeful.
Yeah. And I think it's like for DC, this would be the time, right? Because I like Marvel a lot, but there's been so much Marvel with the addition of Disney Plus in the last few years. And I don't know, for me personally, like I feel this way with wrestling for a while. Sometimes you just get burned out with stuff. And I said, okay, so this would be an ideal time for DC to, if you could put some good I did like the Peacemaker with John Cena, which I know Gunn was a part of, and I thought, oh, okay, that's good. So seeing him work on that, knowing success with Guardians, I'd like to think he could do something well. But yeah, it's still kind of like you said, kind of a wait and see.
Yeah, and one of my biggest disappointments is Superman, because it's such a shame. It's like, especially I think of kids today that were the age I was when I discovered these characters, and their perception of Superman, it must be so incredibly warped from what it's supposed to be. I mean, Zack Snyder, in my opinion, completely did not understand that character at all. And you had Henry Cavill, who was like the perfectly cast Superman, and he's stuck in these horrible movies. I'm still, you know, I came out of Man of Steel feeling like I'd been mugged, you know, of $15, $12, whatever it was. I feel like they just don't get the character. And because, you know, it's such a pure, idealized character that it's like everybody's like, oh, well, we have to make him flawed, and we have to make the world's going to hate him because he's an alien, and he's got all this, he's got the burden of being Superman. And it's like, no, he loves being Superman. Could you imagine being Superman? It's the greatest damn thing ever to be Superman. It's not, you know, he's not Batman. He's not Batman. How many times, you know, he's not the Punisher. And you have to embrace that. It doesn't mean he's a cornball. It doesn't mean he's a phony. It doesn't mean he's lame. Like, all you got to do is look at the Richard Donner movies and see that it's possible of how to treat that character. And, you know, if you look at, everybody's colored now by the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns. You know, Frank Miller hated Superman. It's clear to see. He made him into a government stooge. He took the whole like world's oldest Boy Scout thing so seriously. And he made him into this insufferable character where you look at him and you go like, boy, I hope Batman kicks his ass, you know? And that's just not what the character was ever intended to be. So I'm hoping somebody comes along who gets that you could actually have a superhero that people look up to, you know, and take it seriously at the same time.
Do you think superhero movies, and maybe especially Marvel movies in the last 15 years, have influenced pro wrestling?
That's a really interesting idea. I think yes, to a certain degree. I think there's cross-pollination. I mean, I think movies are influenced by wrestling. I've thought that for years. When you see, I remember years ago, 20 years ago, when I went to see Freddy versus Jason, and it was one of those times where I thought, like, holy cow, this movie is like a wrestling angle. And whoever wrote this, they must know wrestling. And I came to find out later that that was that was true, that the screenwriters were huge wrestling fans, and they were thinking of things like Jason's going to turn babyface in this movie, which he does.
Right.
And the whole thing, I mean, Freddy does an elbow drop on Jason in the movie. I mean, come on. But I mean, so I've seen stuff like that. I've seen it in the Marvel movies too, like, you know, where I think there's some of that thinking. But I also, yes, I do see, especially recently, like if you look at the Bloodline, for example, that's something where, and I don't want to say it's just Marvel movies or superhero movies, but that's something where you can see how very consciously they are trying to take wrestling storytelling to another level. Sometimes it frustrates fans because they're used to the more traditional style of storytelling, but they're trying to make it more cinematic. They're trying, if you notice, like the wrestlers are much better mic'd, so you could hear what they're saying in the ring much more than you ever used to be able to. It's like they're really trying to add these levels of detail and nuance and slow things down, which I like, because I feel like, you know, we're still recovering from that Vince Russo, like everybody's turning heel and face every week, 47 title changes a month. You know, we're recovering from that, and I think that's a good thing. So yes, I do see a back and forth influence.
Superheroes, a pop culture history of from Ant-Man to Zorro. The link is in the description for this book, Blood and Fire, and Pro Wrestling FAQ. July 1st, you know Northeast Wrestling is coming to Veterans Park in Jewett City as part of the carnival. And at the Working Fans podcast table, Brian R. Solomon has agreed to join us, and you are going to get a chance to buy his books and meet the author himself. We are so excited to have you down there. Pro wrestling doesn't come to my hometown often. I'm going to be able to walk there. So to be able to bring in such a guest and be able to have you be able to sell your books is very exciting. So we're happy that you're going to be joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm actually a big fan of Northeast Wrestling, you know, again, because it's my neck of the woods too. I've been to a lot of their Bethany shows, which is like their home base, you know, and other shows they've done. I'm really good friends with a guy named Eric Valco, who was one of their camera operators for a long time. And so we know a lot of the same people. He's actually going to be coming down with me for this show. But, you know, so I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm glad you invited me to do it. And I'm happy to meet more readers or potential readers of the book. My show is called Shut Up and Wrestle, and it's part of the Arcadian Vanguard network, which is also, they're also the ones that carry Jim Cornette's shows and the 605 Super podcast. So it's a great platform to be on, but it's an old school vintage themed wrestling podcast. And I have different guests each week. So the conversation is so varied. It depends when you listen, you know, what kind of show you're going to get. Like I had George Shire on recently, and we talked about the old AWA and just being a fan in the 50s, 60s, 70s. My new guest that I'm actually, as this is airing, I have Kurt Fuller, who was the star of No Holds Barred with Hulk Hogan. I just had him on. And the next episode is Abraham Josephine Reisman, who's the author of the Vince McMahon book that just came out, Ringmaster, who is a friend of mine. So I was able to book that episode and talk about that book. So like I said, it varies from week to week, and it's Shut Up and Wrestle. You can find it on all the usual platforms, but the website is suawpod.com.
And you've also got the wrestling news, if I'm correct, right?
That's right. I'm busy. The wrestling news, which is Arcadian Vanguard 2, and it's unprecedented. It sounds so simple, but it's unprecedented. We do a daily morning audio newscast of wrestling news. It's strictly news. There's no opinion. There's no clickbait. There's no like stuff that doesn't really qualify as news. Like, hey, find out what Booker T said about Charmel. Like, that's not news. Like, we really focus on actual news that people want to hear from day to day. I write most of the script. The audio, the anchor person is Mike Sempervive, who a lot of people probably know from Wrestling Observer Radio and their shows. So he's a part of it too. We're real proud of it. It's literally every morning. You know, the wrestlingnews.com, and it's also on the Arcadian Vanguard YouTube page.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we hope to have you on again soon, Brian. Have a good one.
All right, guys. Thank you.